This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, begins the show by talking about worms in alfalfa. He shares his recommendations for alfalfa caterpillars, beet armyworms, fall armyworms, and garden webworms. K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster continues today's show discussing Phragmites and how to tell the difference between native and non-native species. Ending the show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk explaining why it is important for dairy farmers to have a nutrition program specifically designed for gestating cows. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show talking about worms and alfalfa with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, anytime.
Jeff, talking about a few different worms today, and beginning with the alfalfa caterpillar.
Yes, it seems like we've talked so dang much all summer about fall armyworms in just about every crop and lawn and throughout Kansas, and we have. That's the reason why it seems like that. And we're kind of ending that season, I hope, but not yet. And I've gotten a lot of calls, and I've been out in several alfalfa fields in the last week that are just about ready to be cut or have just been swathed. And there are a lot of worms out there. Now, there are 4 different kinds in all the fields that I sampled, and I use a sweep net to sample them. It's the easiest and the fastest way. I use a sweep net, and the 4 different species I've found in every field. First of all, like you said, the alfalfa caterpillar. A little bit about the alfalfa caterpillar. These are the yellow and white moths you see flying just above alfalfa fields or soybean fields, especially after a little rain. You might see them gathering around a little pool of water before it evaporates, drinking the water. That's the moth, the adult. And those, everybody always says, yeah, look at them. They're out there pollinating that alfalfa field. They're not, because there aren't any flowers usually in the alfalfa by the time you cut it. They're out there depositing eggs. And these are called sulfur butterflies, but they turn into alfalfa caterpillars. They lay these little eggs singly. Every time you see the moth dip down, she's depositing an egg on the leaf. Again, it can be soybeans or alfalfa. I've seen them, a lot of folks call me this time of year because there's not that many other plants out there that's green other than the alfalfa. So the moths are depositing eggs. The eggs will hatch into these little, I think they're really neat looking larvae. They're kind of a velvety green, dark green larvae. They're pretty small when they first emerge from the egg, so you're not going to notice them for a while, but they'll feed on the leaves. The thing is, these moths deposit eggs singly here and there. So I've never seen a population of the larvae of the alfalfa caterpillar itself to cause a problem, but I've seen guys spray because they think there's too many moths out there and there's going to be a problem with larvae. The thing is, they're pretty common right now. They're going to be out there until we get a hard frost. They overwinter in Kansas. So, as long as the weather stays like it is, they're going to be out there feeding. They're going to contribute to the feeding damage caused by the other 3 that I'm going to talk about. So that's the alfalfa caterpillar. That's the larvae that comes from those white and yellow moths that you see flying over the fields. The second one I want to talk about is the beet armyworm. Now, we've talked about armyworms a lot this year. There are a lot of true armyworms. There are a lot. This is a relative. They're really not much different as far as the feeding goes. There's going to be several generations a year. Again, they're going to probably overwinter in Kansas, so they're probably going to be there until we get a hard freeze, just like the armyworm. You can find armyworms, true armyworms, in alfalfa also, but I didn't find any in the fields I looked at recently. It's just the beet armyworm. The beet armyworm, that can cause problems because they lay eggs in clusters. Anytime you see the term army, means you can see lots of them at any one time. That's how they got that common name. So beet armyworm, the moth lays eggs in clusters, and they will hatch, and there'll be a bunch of them feeding in an area. So generally, we don't have enough of them to worry about throughout a whole field, but in an area where the moth has deposited eggs, they can defoliate it pretty good. So it gets everybody's attention, but probably not enough to trigger an application of an insecticide. Again, but that's a contributing factor because you got the alfalfa caterpillar and you got the beet armyworms. The third one I want to talk about, again, I hate to talk about it because we've talked about it so much, the fall armyworm. There still are quite a few fall armyworms around. They're still feeding on anything green. The only thing about the fall armyworm, they don't overwinter in Kansas. And the ones I found, the larvae that I found last week were mature larvae. So I'm guessing those are probably going to pupate 4 or 5 days and head south for overwintering. Now I say that with one caveat because one year they stayed probably this time of year be one more generation, and they did cause some problems on some early seeded alfalfa. If the alfalfa is trying to come up and you got a bunch of hungry worms there, that can be a problem. But generally speaking, they're not a problem after the first part of October. I'm hoping that's the case this year also. But just to let everybody know, there are some fall armyworms still around in alfalfa, and they're contributing to the leaf feeding that the alfalfa caterpillars and the beet armyworms have done. The fourth one that's out there, relatively common, is the garden webworm. Sometimes it's called the alfalfa webworm or the spotted webworm. It will get in alfalfa and it'll get in soybeans. The problem with the webworm is a lot of times you go out and you see the webbing on the alfalfa and you don't see any worms. So you think they're done feeding. Not necessarily the case. They're very shy. So they'll feed inside this webbing, but if they see a shadow or if they feel the vibration of something or somebody coming, they drop out of the webbing and they get into the leaf litter below the canopy of the alfalfa. So you think they're gone, but they're still there and they'll crawl back up and continue feeding. They're smaller than the others we talked about, but they can be in large numbers also within these webbed areas. The moth lays quite a few eggs in one area and then flies off, and same thing in several areas of the field. But they're easy to determine if they're there because of the webbing. You got to determine if they're still actively feeding, because once they have pupated, they will pupate in the leaf litter and you won't know it either. So you got to get out and check. One of the things about I've heard over the years and I've seen a lot of growers, especially those that are going to use their hay locally to feed their own livestock, they worry about that fecal material, because if you have a big collection of these larvae feeding in this webbing that fecal material is produced, it can accumulate in large numbers. And they always worry about that as far as the health of the livestock goes. But we've checked it a couple of times and there's no problem. I don't know if it's just because there's not enough of it or it just doesn't have anything toxic or pathogenic anyway, but that's not a problem. But there can be pretty good size areas enclosed in this webbing, and these things will eat everything within that webbing. So those are the four worms that are really active right now. The question is, if you're going to swath it, and it looks like, we're supposed to have some rain early in this week and then it's going to dry out. The question I'm getting, should I spray it and then swath it, or should I swath it and see what happens? My recommendation for these four species, go ahead and cut it. None of them are going to feed on the hay. None of them are going to feed on the cut product. They have to have the growing vegetation to feed on. So once you cut it, that's going to be the end of them, unless they're pretty small and they're still feeding on that plant as it tries to come back after the cutting. And everybody wants that last regrowth to put that nutrition into the roots for overwintering. So you got to get out and check it out. But I've been in probably in the last week, I've been in several alfalfa fields. All of them have these worms. I've not seen any that, even totaling the whole complex, would reach a treatment threshold. They're there and they are defoliating a little bit, but not over the whole field. So just keep that in mind. Also, once you swath, if you expose those worms, a lot of times the birds will come in and pick them up once they're out there in the open. Birds help a lot depending upon if there's any birds around or not. But if you see flocks of blackbirds or anything like that in your field, that's probably the reason they're feeding on these. If until it's cut, these worms are all pretty well protected. They hide pretty well and pretty cryptically colored. But once you've cut it, it exposes them. They may feed a little bit under the windrows as that plant starts to regrow, but they're not going to do enough to economically affect your yield or your hay that you pull off that field. So just wanted to make sure everybody understands. Also, we talked a little bit about army cutworms. Army cutworms are just starting to come back into the state. They'll be laying eggs over the next month or two, but those shouldn't be a problem for a while. It's right now, if you're going to swath, not swath. If you decide to swath ahead of time, I would not treat the stubble. I would go out and check it and make sure there's worms out there before you do. I think that'll probably take care of your problem. If you decide to treat with an insecticide before you swath, make dang sure you check the label, and check the pre-harvest interval. Each insecticide has a different pre-harvest interval between the time when you actually make the application until when you can legally harvest that product. So just either way, it's your choice. I've not seen worms this time of year enough to have to worry about, but get out and check it out, and good luck. It looks like the fall weather is finally going to get here a little bit. Should be good bug growing weather.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us.
My pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing Phragmites with K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
Sarah, what is Phragmites?
So most of our listeners, Shelby, have probably seen Phragmites in ditches when they're driving around the countryside. It is a grass-like species that is really an aquatic species. It grows in wet areas, so road ditches, along creeks, lakes, all kinds of different bodies of water is where we're most likely to find it. It is a perennial plant, so it can produce by seeds or by rhizomes. And so it can form these really dense stands that basically become, monocultures and kind of squeeze out any other desirable species that might otherwise be in the area.
Does it sometimes go by a different name?
So it can also be called common reed. And honestly, that's how I first learned it, was common reed. But a lot of folks will just call it Phragmites. You'll even hear the folks that work with it a lot, they'll just call it frag.
Is it something that sometimes gets confused with a plant that's okay in Kansas?
Yeah, so one of the things that can be a little bit of a challenge when we think about managing Phragmites is that it does have a sibling almost in the plant world that is a native plant that is not aggressive and invasive. So they're actually the same genus and species, just a different subspecies. So one is good and came from elsewhere, and the other one is native and will not take over and form these monocultures. So, if you're looking at a creek, for example, or a drainage of some sort, and you see this big, tall, grassy looking plant, it's not a cattail, and it's not really spreading or expanding, it's probably not the invasive Phragmites australis, that we're talking about today.
Are there a few ways people can tell the native and non-native apart?
There are. So, the first one, like I said, is that non-native invasive one does form these really dense monocultures. One of the things about those dense stands is that the stems will actually remain upright and the leaves will hold on to the stems throughout the winter. So you'll see a lot of kind of standing dead biomass in those invasive stands. The invasive ones tend to have rougher and greener stems, whereas the natives will have kind of a red color on their stem. And then I mentioned that the leaf retention after senescence. So the leaves will actually hold on longer in the invasive one.
And you've mentioned that the non-native ones form a monoculture. Is there anything that can take them out, like another plant, or does it have to be removal or herbicides?
There's not really a good option for like other plants that are going to come back in and displace this invasive species once it becomes established. So, when you think about how it's changing that ecosystem, it changes it so that there's really no room that's favorable for more desirable plants to come in.
And so what are some management options?
So some things that we think about, the questions that I get are largely about herbicide applications aerially. And really right now, the big thing is drones, right? So drone applications of different herbicides. That's probably the most cost-effective way to do this. The downside of this option is that it's really pretty non-selective in terms of the herbicides that we use. So aquatic labeled glyphosate formulations, because remember, this plant is probably going to be growing in water. So you got to have an aquatic label and an aerial application label on the product that you're going to use. So aquatic formulations of glyphosate and then aquatic formulations of imazapyr or arsenal are two of the most common herbicides that we talk about using. And then imazamox or clearcast is the aquatic formulation of that herbicide, does also have some activity.
Is it a one and done application or multiple times?
Like any perennial species, Shelby, it's gonna take multiple applications and monitoring. So, anecdotally, when I talk to folks who are making some of these drone applications, they talk about, they'll spray it and it'll look really nice, right? This fall, it'll look pretty good next spring. But if they come back, 12, 18, 24 months later, they'll see that there's regrowth. The good thing about that, though, is that once you've done that kind of big broadcast application, hopefully you can get by with just spot spraying. And so then you'll have an opportunity for some of the desirable species to come back in.
Are there any management options that aren't herbicides?
There are some kind of physical or mechanical options. Most of them are going to be either very labor intensive or require some pretty expensive machinery. So things that can be done, you can go in and mechanically remove it. So kind of like digging it up underground. There are options to just remove the top. One option that is interesting is to remove the top growth below the surface of the water. And so even though it's an aquatic plant, it still has to have oxygen. And so it derives that oxygen from the leaves sticking out above the surface of the water. And so if you remove those and then flood it, you can kind of drown it out. Fire could be an option. If you go in with fire at a time when the plants are not green, right? So during the dormant season, go in and burn off all that top growth. And so really that is used more, though, as a way to get better control with our herbicides.
Is there a time of year where application or removal is the best or should have the best response?
When we think about herbicide applications for perennial plants, Shelby, one of the times that generally is going to work well for control is the point in time when that plant is starting to translocate photosynthates, or the energy that it makes in photosynthesis. It's going to start moving all of that down to the roots. So usually that's going to be after it's had enough energy going to the flowers to produce seed, and now it's going to move things down to the roots. And so this time of year is generally pretty good. So as we look at, for example, a glyphosate application, the recommendation is to apply it after flowering, but before the first killing frost. So we're in that window. Arsenal applications have a little bit longer recommended window, so they can start after that elongation of the full leaves. So once it basically gets as tall as it's going to get, and has as much leaf area as you think it's going to get.
If they start by water, can they continue to expand out and get further away and still be okay?
They can grow a ways up the bank, but you don't see them in upland situations for sure, Shelby. They're definitely lowland. It's one of those plants I don't know how much driving across pastures you've done, but there are certain plants that if you see that plant growing in the pasture, you don't take a vehicle there, even if you think it looks dry, right? This would be one of those species. It is only going to grow in those low-lying, wetter areas.
Are people able to, even if they're not able to actually control it, help report it and maybe get it controlled other ways?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about species that are potentially invasive is there's a mapping system. It's called EDD MapS, and that stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping Systems. It's a web platform or a website that is managed by the Southern IPM Center. Pretty cool website. We're looking at it for some agronomic applications as well. But in this case, users can go online and kind of register with the sites. And then if you are, say, boating or camping or hiking and you see this, or if you're driving on your property and you see it, right, you can then go in and report it on the site. So you can, tell them where you're at and snap a picture and post it to the website. They prefer to have folks uploading to the site that have some that are trustworthy, right? Like if you got to submit it to iNaturalist to see if it is what it is, we probably, those aren't necessarily the folks we want to have reporting, but, folks who know what they're looking at, we definitely want to have them reporting the occurrences of this plant. And so the thinking behind that, Shelby, is that the more we know about where it is, the better we can control it, because you can't manage it if you don't know it's there. And so it's just trying to keep these species as contained as possible, right? We're past the eradication stage, is always going to be here, but we're just trying to keep it contained.
So if someone thinks they might have it, but they don't know if it's native or non-native, what's the best course of getting it identified?
Well, the standard answer to that, Shelby, coming from your extension specialist, is to visit with their local extension agent. Those folks have access. A lot of them know what it is and call me about it. If not, they have access to folks who do. Not only, plants like this, but if they have anything that they need identified, right? We can help them with that. If I don't know it as a weed scientist, we have a whole herbarium full of people whose expertise is identifying plants. And so if I get stumped, I just ship it over there and they come back with an answer, and then I can tell you how to control it.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Always a pleasure, Shelby.
That was K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will link the e-update article that talks about Phragmites, where you will also be able to find the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. For most of the year, beef producers are generally feeding two animals, the cow and her unborn calf. Maternal nutrition is extremely important not only to the cow, but also to her unborn calf. Research shows that how dams are fed will impact the future production of the calf that she's carrying. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk explains why it's important for dairy farmers to focus on genetics, but also the right nutrition program for gestating cows.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers about a topic that has been coming up in our nutrition circles as we look at the impact of the nutrition programs that we have for our gestating cows, how that impacts our offspring or the heifers that are being born into our herds. As we think about the heifers that we have on our farm and those calves that are coming into our herds, we got to be concerned about what the future looks like for those animals and how they're going to impact our dairy herd as well as the profitability of our farms. So for many, many decades now, we've recognized the importance of genetics in this process, and we've got these excellent genetic selection programs now that we utilize to, just program in the right genetics into our herd and to try to fine-tune that. But today I want to encourage you that it's more than just the genetics. If the animals are actually going to be able to express their genetic potential, then they need to have the right nutrition programs in place as well. one of the things over the last decade or so that we've become increasingly interested in and aware of is the importance of the nutrition of the dam and how that impacts the growth of the offspring. You know, for many years we've recognized that protein nutrition and energy nutrition, actually the excesses or not having enough of either of those nutrients in the diet, would have a negative impact on the offspring. However, as we've moved forward in the last 10 years, there's probably some things that we need to continue to fine-tune in those rations over and above protein and energy, although those tend to still be very important to our nutrition program of these dams that are carrying these very expensive calves today. So what are some other things that you might need to consider? Well, number one, the reason you need to consider these things is we do have good research now that shows that how we feed the dam will impact the future production of that calf that she is carrying. So whether we look at how that impacts future milk production, how it impacts marbling or carcass traits of that animals, they're all impacted. So some of the things that you might want to visit with your nutritionist about as you think about the nutrition of those dams that are in your herd, you might want to talk about things like rumen-protected methionine and lysine. Are we doing that? Is it something that we need to do? Because we know that there are some very positive effects on the growth of the offspring when we do supplement our animals with these things. Some other things that are coming to light is the importance of omega-3 fatty acid supplements and how that impacts the growth and production of the offspring that animal is going to have. So as we think about the genetic potential of those young calves, we really need to be concerned that we're feeding the dam in a way that will allow that calf to grow and contain the genetic material and the ability to express that genetic material in terms of milk production and growth potential after the animal is born. So the importance of the nutrition of the dam becomes more of a focus for us on our dairy. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to have a conversation with your nutritionist about the nutrition of these important dams that we have in our herd and the calves that will result from those pregnancies.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.